I never thought I'd be here, sitting in the quiet of my living room, wondering how everything went so wrong. I guess if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you we were solid. But here I am, and here we are, barely talking, barely holding on. So, let me introduce myself. My name's Olivia, and I'm 33 years old. I've been married to Mark, 37, for almost 9 years now. We've got 2 kids, Ethan, who's 8, and Sophie, who's 5. Honestly, when I think back to when we first met, things seem so simple. Mark was the type of guy who had his life together. He had a steady job, a good sense of humor, and a way of making me feel like everything would be okay no matter what. He took care of things, took care of us. It was easy to fall into the routine of life. Work, school runs, family dinners, weekends filled with park visits or movie nights. Things were going well, I thought. But lately, it's like I've been living with a stranger. Not in a dramatic, he's cheating kind of way, but in the way that he's so distant. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but something just felt off. I remember a few weeks ago, things started to shift. Mark came home from work late, but it wasn't just the lateness, it was the heaviness in his footsteps. You know, when you can hear someone's exhaustion in the way they walk. That's what it felt like. He didn't even greet me properly that night, just dropped his bag by the door and plopped down on the couch. I noticed the bags under his eyes were darker than usual. I went to the kitchen to make dinner, thinking maybe he had a rough day, but when I called out to him asking how it went, he just shrugged. Now, normally, Mark would give me this whole story about how work went, his boss being a jerk and all that. But that day, he just mumbled something about not feeling great. I didn't think much of it at first. I just assumed he was tired. But over the next few days, it became obvious this wasn't a one-off thing. He was acting more and more withdrawn, quieter than usual. His routine started changing, too. Every night after dinner, he'd retreat into the bedroom with his phone or his laptop, and I'd be left to handle everything else, getting the kids to bed, cleaning up, figuring out how to balance the bills. And, I don't know, I could feel it in the air between us. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd brush me off. First, I thought maybe he was just stressed from work. But as the days went by, I started to get frustrated. The house was becoming chaotic. Sophie's toys were scattered all over the living room. Ethan kept getting in trouble at school, and it felt like I was juggling a million things at once. Meanwhile, Mark was so quiet and, honestly, a little cold. I couldn't even get him to talk to me about how we were doing as a couple. He didn't seem interested in anything I had to say. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped at him. We were in the kitchen, me cooking, him leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone, and I just said it. "What's going on with you, Mark? Why are you so distant? Why won't you talk to me anymore?" Came out more harshly than I intended, but I was so fed up. It wasn't like him. The Mark I married wasn't like this. The Mark I married would have sat down with me, talked through things, even if it was just to vent about his day. But now he just seemed checked out. He didn't even respond at first. He just stared at me, his eyes kind of blank. It was like he didn't hear me at all. I felt like I was talking to a wall. And that stung. So I tried to lighten the mood like I always did, trying to joke about it. I said something like, "Oh, come on, don't act like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. We're a team, right?" I tried to laugh it off, but he just looked at me like I was the one who'd been shutting him out. I didn't get it. Why was he acting like this? I mean, we've been through so much together. We've dealt with financial issues before, tough situations with the kids, and yet we always managed to pull through. Why was this any different? So I gave him some space. Maybe he just needed a little time to cool off. But something inside me told me that wasn't it. That this was different. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I could fix it on my own. A few days went by, and the silence between Mark and me grew unbearable. I kept telling myself things would get back to normal. I mean, every couple has their rough patches, right? But the longer we went without talking, the more I felt like we were drifting further apart. The worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. I couldn't even figure out what had happened to us. It was like we had become strangers sharing the same house. It didn't help that Mark had stopped coming home on time. Work was always a reason, but it wasn't like it used to be. Before, he'd come home, tired but still ready to talk about his day, even if it was just to complain. Now, he'd walk in late, sometimes even avoiding eye contact. He was always on his phone, checking emails, making calls, even when it was family time. I didn't mind him working hard, but this felt different. Felt like he was avoiding me. And the kids? He barely spent time with them. Finn had been asking where Dad was every day, and it broke my heart every time. And then it happened. It was a Friday evening when Mark came home earlier than usual, but something about his expression made my stomach drop. He walked into the living room like he was carrying the weight of the world. He didn't greet me. Didn't even say anything. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't expect it to be this. Mark, who always said he was indispensable, who always prided himself on his career and job security, walked in and said the words that shattered everything. I lost my job. I froze. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I thought he was joking. Mark was always the one telling me how solid his job was, how he was practically untouchable. So yeah, I laughed and I even made a joke about it. Well, guess you'll finally have time to hang those Christmas lights, huh? I thought I was being lighthearted, trying to ease the tension, but the look on his face told me everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just looked at me like I'd slapped him. I could see the hurt in his eyes, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't some casual situation. Mark wasn't just tired from work. He was crushed. He had been blindsided. But instead of offering him the support he needed, I reacted poorly. I couldn't stop myself. Instead of comforting him, I got defensive. Well, maybe if you weren't always complaining about your job, you could have seen this coming, I blurted out. The second the words left my mouth, I regretted them. I watched Mark's face fall, his jaw tightening as though I'd punched him. He didn't say anything. He didn't even argue. He just looked at me, eyes wide, before starting to explain what had been happening at work. He talked about how his company had been downsizing for months, how he saw the signs, but he never thought it would actually happen to him. He looked so lost, and it broke me. But instead of stepping in and comforting him, I threw my arms up in frustration, saying, "We'll figure it out. We always do." Came out so dismissive, and I didn't even realize how bad it sounded until I saw the hurt in his eyes again. Mark exploded. He started listing all the bills we had, how little was left in our savings, which, by the way, I had no clue was that low, and how my "we'll figure it out" attitude wasn't going to be enough this time. His voice grew louder, more desperate. He was angry, but it wasn't just anger. It was fear. Fear for our family, fear for our future. And there I was, sitting in silence, arms crossed, trying to convince myself that he was overreacting. I mean, yes, losing his job was a big deal. But the world hadn't ended, right? We still had a roof over our heads. Kids were still healthy. It wasn't like we were about to starve. But Mark was acting like the sky was falling, and I couldn't understand why. Maybe I was too busy focusing on how to keep everything running smoothly to realize how much pressure Mark had been under. But that didn't stop me from feeling like he was making it worse. Then he said it. The words that shook me to my core. "Olivia, you don't take anything seriously. You think life is just a joke, but it's not. And I can't carry this family anymore." That hit me hard. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was the first time he had said it out loud. He had always been the strong one, the provider. He was always the rock. But now I could see it in his eyes. He was drowning, and I had been too caught up in my own frustration to even notice. I knew he was right. But instead of admitting that, I lashed out. I didn't want to admit that I had been wrong. I wasn't ready to accept it. And that's when I said the worst thing I could have said. I looked at him and snapped. "Maybe if you were better at your job, we wouldn't be in this mess." As soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I had crossed a line. It was like the air in the room changed. Mark just stared at me, eyes wide with disbelief. His face was a mix of anger and hurt, and he didn't say anything. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just grabbed his coat, stood up, and walked out of the house. I sat there, stunned. How had we gotten here? It wasn't supposed to be like this. I hadn't meant to hurt him. I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But as I sat there, the weight of what I'd said, what I had done, started to sink in. I had made everything worse. And when Mark didn't come back, when he didn't even text me, I realized how far we had fallen. The next few days were the longest of my life. I kept telling myself it was just a temporary thing, that Mark just needed time to cool off. But as the hours turned into days, I began to wonder if I had pushed him too far. I had no idea where he was or when he would come back. He wasn't answering his phone, and every time I checked my messages, my heart would drop when I saw that there was nothing from him. I started questioning everything, our relationship, myself, our future. I thought back to all the little signs that I had ignored for so long. Maybe I had been too focused on my own needs, my own frustrations, to notice how much stress Mark had been under. Maybe I was the one who had been taking things for granted all these years. But none of those thoughts helped me now. What was done, and Mark wasn't coming back anytime soon. I tried to focus on the kids. Ethan had been so quiet since Mark left, but he was still asking about his dad every day. Mia, of course, was too young to understand what was happening. She just wanted her dad to come home and play with her like he always did. But it was getting harder to explain. I didn't know what to tell them. How could I explain to them that the man I had promised to be with forever was no longer part of our lives? How could I make them understand that I was the one who had made it happen? I remember one night, sitting in the living room, the kids asleep in their rooms. The house felt empty, quieter than I had ever remembered. I kept staring at the spot on the couch where Mark used to sit, the place where we'd spend hours talking after the kids went to bed, laughing at silly things, making plans for the future. Now it was just an empty space. My chest tightened as I thought about it. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to admit that I was losing him. I didn't want to accept the possibility that I might have ruined everything. But then something inside me snapped. I couldn't just sit here waiting for him to come back. I needed to do something. I had to fix this, or at least try to. But I didn't even know where to start. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you tell someone you're sorry for breaking their heart when you don't even know how to fix the mess you've made? I had tried to reach out to him a few times, but he didn't respond. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and call him again, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I knew I had messed up, and deep down I was afraid of hearing what he would say to me. Would he yell at me? Would he tell me it was over for good? Would he even care that I was sorry? Then one night I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, and I saw something that stopped me cold. It was an ad for a new career opportunity, one that could change everything for me. It was a chance to finally get the job I had been talking about for years, the one that would bring in more money, the one that would let me stop relying on Mark to take care of everything. And for a brief moment, I wondered if this could be the solution. If I took this job, maybe I wouldn't need Mark to fix everything for me anymore. Maybe I could start over, rebuild my life without him. I didn't act on it. Not immediately. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me. Felt like a sign, like the universe was pushing me towards something new, something better. Maybe it wasn't just about fixing my relationship with Mark. Maybe it was about fixing me. But then, the very next morning, I heard from Mark. It was a text message, short and to the point. "We need to talk." I felt a rush of panic. Was he finally going to tell me it was over? Was he going to finally give me the ultimatum I had been avoiding? Or was he going to let me explain, let me apologize for the things I had said, for the way I had pushed him away? I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending like nothing was wrong. The days of avoiding the truth were over. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop that afternoon. I was a nervous wreck the whole time. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop replaying the last few days in my head. I had to face him. I had to own up to what I had done. When I walked in, Mark was already sitting at a table near the window. His face was unreadable. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. The man I had married, the man I had spent the last 9 years of my life with, was now someone I barely recognized. He didn't smile when I sat down. He didn't greet me like he used to. He just stared at me, and for a second I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "I've been thinking a lot," Mark said, his voice low, almost distant. "About everything. About us." I swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. This was it, the moment where I either fixed things or made them worse. My mind raced, but no words came out. Instead, I just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've been trying to figure out where we went wrong," he said. "I've been thinking about the past few months, the way we've been drifting apart. I don't know if I can fix this, Olivia." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. "Mark, I know I've messed up. I know I've been difficult. But I never wanted to hurt you. I stopped myself, realizing I wasn't even sure what I was trying to say. I just don't want to lose you." Mark didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at his coffee, the steam rising in the air. I could see him thinking, processing everything. I wanted to scream, to beg him to forgive me, to tell him that I was sorry and that I would do anything to make it right. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, letting him have the space to say whatever he needed to say. Finally, Mark looked up at me. "I don't know, Olivia. Maybe I need more than just words. Maybe I need to see that you're really ready to change. I can't keep carrying everything on my own." The weight of his words hit me harder than anything else. This wasn't just about me saying sorry. This was about showing him that I was willing to fight for us, that I could be the partner he needed, not just the one who constantly took from him. The days after that conversation felt like a blur. I kept thinking about what Mark had said, how he couldn't keep carrying everything on his own. That was a reality check for me. I had taken him for granted, assuming he would always be there to pick up the pieces when I messed up. But now I had to prove that I could carry some of the weight too. I started thinking more about my own behavior. I had always told myself that I was the fun one, the one who brought the laughter into the house. I'd joke around, avoid serious conversations, and try to keep things light. But when you avoid things long enough, they start to pile up. And I realized that all the laughter in the world couldn't cover up the cracks in our relationship anymore. I thought about the time I had spent avoiding the real issues, the things that I had kept pushing aside because it was easier to pretend everything was fine. Maybe Mark wasn't perfect, but I wasn't either. I was the one who had been too busy chasing my own fun, trying to avoid reality, to see how much he was struggling. He had been trying to keep everything together, while I had been living in a bubble of denial, only waking up when things started to unravel. It was hard to admit, but I had to take responsibility. I wasn't just a victim of the situation, I had contributed to it. I realized that fixing this wasn't just about apologizing. It was about changing the way I approached life, about making real changes instead of just talking about them. I had to show Mark that I was willing to work on myself and that I could handle the tough stuff without running away from it. But even though I knew what needed to be done, actually doing it felt overwhelming. I kept putting off the hard conversations. Every time I thought about sitting down with Mark and really hashing things out, the fear crept in. What if he didn't believe me? What if he had already given up on me, on us? What if, after everything, he was still angry and hurt? I didn't know if I could face the possibility that he might not be willing to give me another chance. Then one evening, a week after our conversation at the coffee shop, Mark came home late. I had been cleaning the kitchen when I heard the sound of the front door opening. I didn't expect him to walk in with a big smile or any grand gestures. But I did expect him to say something. To acknowledge that we had talked, that we had started to rebuild something, even if it was just a small step forward. Instead, he walked in silently, took off his coat, and sat down at the table. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. The weight of the silence between us was suffocating. I tried to hold it together, but the longer the silence dragged on, the harder it was to keep up the facade of calm. Mark, I said, my voice shaking, can we talk? He looked up at me then, his face unreadable. Yeah, we can talk. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I could tell he was trying to keep his emotions in check. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands were tightly gripped together. I wasn't sure if he was holding back for my sake or if he was trying to figure out what he was going to say next. I had to fight the urge to reach out to him, to beg him to say something that would make everything feel better. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, I started, about how I've been avoiding things, how I haven't been there for you like I should have. And you're right. I've taken you for granted. Mark didn't interrupt me. He just listened. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, like he wasn't sure how much he wanted to hear. I know I've messed up, and I don't want to keep running away from the hard stuff. I'm ready to face it, Mark. I'm ready to do the work. I don't want to lose you, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild, but I'm willing to put in the effort. I just need you to give me a chance. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to respond at all. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had no idea what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was he angry? Was he tired of hearing apologies? I could see the exhaustion on his face, the weariness in his eyes. He looked like someone who had been through the ringer for far too long. I'm not asking for perfection, Mark finally said, his voice soft but firm. I just want to know that you're really going to change, that you're not going to keep falling back into the same old habits. I've been carrying this family for so long, and I need to know that you can handle things too, that we can do this together. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. I can do that, I said quietly. I will do that. Mark didn't smile, but he didn't look as distant as he had before. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there in a long time. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the smallest glimmer of trust, the possibility that we could make it through this. I'm willing to give you another chance, he said, his voice low, but it's going to take time. And we're going to have to work at it. No more pretending everything's fine when it's not. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something that could be repaired, something that we could rebuild together, piece by piece. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other.